Welcome to this Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment webinar. So pleased you can join us. Today, the topic for the webinar is what happened at MC13, and we are super fortunate to have with us Australia's Ambassador to the WTO, Mr James Baxter. James, thank you so much for joining us today in a busy schedule. A little bit of background on ACITI. We are a relatively new organisation. We aim to increase awareness of the importance of international trade and investment for Australia and Australians. And we aim to create a forum where innovative and important discussions can happen between business, government, think tanks, analysts, civil society groups on issues that are related to international trade and investment and are of national importance to Australia. So we welcome you to this webinar. Please check out our website. Feel free to subscribe to our newsletter if you'd like to stay up to date with other things that we are doing. But let me quickly begin by introducing James. You're our newly appointed or relatively newly appointed ambassador. So dearest, congratulations. That's fantastic. It's not your first time in Geneva. I think you were our deputy head of mission back in 2012 to 2016. But outside all of your WTO work, you have like vast trade policy, trade negotiation, trade law experience. I think you started with DFAT last century, James, if I remember correctly, which, you know, it's 2024. That was a while ago. So that's really saying something. You've been, I think you started in our embassy in Tokyo back in 1997. Then you were a councillor in Brussels. More recently, you were our chief negotiator for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was, I imagine, hugely challenging role. And most recently, you've been First Assistant Secretary for the Office of Trade Negotiations in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So huge experience, super grateful to have you. So the topic, as I said today, is the outcomes from MC13. Anyone that knows WTO will know its history from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, where we had 8 big trade negotiating rounds, to the WTO, I think started operation in 1995. Since then, every approximately 2 years, COVID's interrupted some, and trying to find a venue has been an issue on other years. So every 2 years, roughly, ministers from the WTO's 164, now 166 members will get together to try and conclude negotiations that have been ongoing in the WTO. Now, while we had multilateral trade rounds under GATT and we had the Doha round under the WTO, we haven't really had a major, well, Doha really ended without a conclusion, and we haven't had a multilateral trade round since then. So the importance of these ministerial conferences has really grown as the key mechanism for achieving rule reform, for introducing new issues into the WTO. So they're incredibly important. And to be frank, I mean, we've had, these ministerial conferences have had a history of pulling the rabbit out of a hat. That they've come up with outcomes despite all the odds many times. But I have to say, for MC13, despite having a very broad agenda of items, the outcomes were probably disappointing. From someone that has huge faith and has been a huge supporter of the WTO, the outcomes were disappointing. The agenda, as I said, was huge. E-commerce moratorium, fisheries, leftover work from MC12, agriculture, development issues, WTO reform, dispute settlement reform, TRIPS, new accessions, then the joint statement initiatives, huge agenda. So with that agenda, despite that big agenda, we didn't sort of see some really great concrete outcomes that demonstrated the value and the importance of the WTO and where we're going in future. So enough of me speaking. We're really keen to hear from you, James, on, particularly with an Australian lens, what were Australia's key priorities going into MC13 and where did we land on those? So I will hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Prue, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this group that is really, I'm pleased to say, is really establishing itself in Australia's policy landscape. It was a gap that you identified, and I think it's one that you're filling commendably well. And I think just having the opportunity to talk about some of these issues that perhaps don't grab the headlines, but are nevertheless economically or commercially important to Australia is something that's very welcome from the government's point of view. And it's really in that context that it's terrific to be able to talk about the WTO and the recent Ministerial Conference, because it's not an organisation that gets a lot of headlines. I think, for many people, it's an organisation, to the extent that they've heard of it, is perhaps past its prime or even past its effectiveness. I think there have been a lot of questions asked about it, including because things like the Doha round didn't end up concluding, and now we have problems with the dispute settlement system. It's very easy when we talk about those things to become dismissive of the organisation, but it remains very important to Australia's economic and commercial interests globally, and will in the future. And that's why the government invests so heavily in it. So we actually had two ministers attend MC13. We had the Minister for Trade and Tourism, Senator Farrell, and the Assistant Minister for Trade and Manufacturing, Senator Tim Ayres. And that's, a further indication of how important the organisation is to Australia. Looking at things from an Australian perspective, and perhaps picking up where you left off in terms of expectations, I think you've done a pretty good job of setting out where the expectations were generally heading into the conference. And from Australia's point of view, our aspirations largely mirrored those, perhaps with a few different areas of nuance, and I'll go through those. But really heading into the conference, our main priority was to promote reform of the organisation, and in particular restoration of the dispute settlement system. And that's because the system has been at least partially paralysed now for nearly 5 years with the appellate body inoperative. We have found workarounds, but they don't apply to most of the membership. And we have been very keen to restore enforceability of the rules to the organisation's, I suppose, armoury. And that's something that we share with many other members of all sizes. And we've made some good progress, I think, in discussions about what a reformed system should look like, but a lot remains to be done. And so that was an area we wanted to see moved forward in Abu Dhabi. Beyond that, I think our top priority was probably renewal of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic commerce or digital trade. That's something that is commercially very important to Australian stakeholders and stakeholders around the world. It was important for Australia as well, for strategic as well as economic reasons, that Timor-Leste's accession be finalised and formally adopted. We also were aiming, of course, for an outcome on agricultural reform. That's something that Australia has been doing for a very long time, and that you yourself have played an important role in Peru, and you would appreciate the extent to which we invest effort in that still, challenging though it is. That was certainly a priority for us. We were also, as you noted, mindful of the opportunity to conclude the remaining issues in the fisheries subsidies negotiations, the so-called second wave of negotiations that was supposed to build on the first agreement that was concluded at MC12 in the middle of 2022. Then on the WTO reform agenda, we had a couple of other aspirations. One which is quite new in what we call the deliberative arm. This is where WTO members get to discuss things. So it's different from the negotiation of rules, and it's different from the enforcement of rules in the dispute settlement dimension. It's about promoting policy dialogues. It's something that we as WTO members do on very specific issues in sector-specific WTO committees, whether they're on services or on quarantine, SPS issues, or on technical barriers to trade. We tend not to do that sort of thing as much at a horizontal level on some of the big issues facing WTO members and how the trade rules can support them. And that was something we were hoping to transform. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we also were looking at MC13 as an opportunity to promote reform of the negotiating arm. And here again, just going back to your comments about the failed Doha round, what we and others have been doing really for more than a decade is seeking to identify ways to develop rules, global rules, so within a WTO framework, when it's not possible to get consensus to launch negotiations. And so the device we have used is to bring together a subset of interested members and develop what we call plurilateral negotiations, and they're effectively, their membership is effectively self-selecting. And there are a few of those on the agenda. They were coincidentally set up launched at MC11 back in 2017, and they're called in WTO parlance Joint Statement Initiatives, or JSIs, which is for those who don't know that acronym, that what we mean by that is a plurilateral negotiation. And there was one which we had finalised, we, along with other WTO members, had finalised the substance of heading into MC13. And we were hoping MC13 would be an opportunity to incorporate that formally in the WTO framework of rules. And that's an agreement on investment facilitation. It's called the Investment Facilitation for Development. Now, in terms of, so they were our aspirations. Maybe if I can just quickly go through where, from Australia's point of view, we got to on all of those, unless you have any questions or thoughts. Okay.
No, that's a great way to proceed.
All right. So starting with WTO reform, and here I'll just bring them all together. So the most important priority for us was on dispute settlement. There, we as WTO members had launched discussions back in 2022, slightly before MC12 actually, with a view to restoring the system, an effective system that would be accessible to all in the parlance we're using in the WTO by 2024. And effectively, this exercise was initiated by the United States as a way of identifying whether members could reach convergence on what reforms to the system would be needed to make the system effectively acceptable to the United States, because it was the United States that blocked and ultimately caused the paralysis of the appellate body, and hence the partial freeze on its operations that we're subject to now.
And I'd just add, some people assume that was under President Trump, but that was actually under President Obama, wasn't it?
Well, so it started under President Obama, although it definitely had its conclusion under President Trump in 2019 that the appellate body finally got to the point where it didn't have enough members on it to operate anymore.
Okay.
So it's been nearly 5 years since that happened. Mm-hmm. Now, we have made a lot of progress in informal discussions in Geneva on the sort of reforms that could be made to restore the system to what we would all like it, how we'd like it to operate, and that would be something that's faster, more efficient, quite frankly, cheaper for governments, and therefore more accessible to developing countries. Because there is a concern that the system developed in a way that meant it became overly legalistic, that spun out timeframes, it spun out the level of detail being addressed in claims made in disputes, and that was benefiting the legal profession in some ways more than members. So we've made a lot of progress, but we had not got to fixes on some of the key areas of difference, the most notable of which is the role of appeal in the system. So as I mentioned, the US, and many would know, the US had concerns about the way the WTO's appellate body had evolved. and it's more broadly questioned whether an appeal function is even needed, or whether you could go back to a pre-WTO style adjudication mechanism whereby you have an ad hoc panel of experts get together to determine the outcome of disputes between members. We haven't reached convergence on that, so we knew we weren't going to restore the system at MC13. What we did do, though, was, I think, reach very wide convergence, if not, in fact, I think consensus, that we had made good progress, that it was worth building on that progress, it was worth accelerating discussions, and that we should still work towards finalising and restoring the reforms and restoring the system this year. So that's where there was a separate ministerial declaration issued on dispute settlement reform, and that's effectively what it said. It will be
James,
very challenging. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask whether you have a view on, well, what's the main issue holding up convergence on this issue? Is it a particular player, or is it a particular issue, or it's both?
So I think the main issue at the moment is this question of appeal, and whether there should be an appeal tier at all, or whether there should be, as there was under the as there currently is under the dispute settlement understanding, appeal as of right. So at the moment, any member who has a main party to a dispute at a panel stage can appeal the panel report. And that means an awful lot of disputes get appealed or have been appealed. And this is something that wasn't originally envisaged when the system was set up. Appeals were supposed to be exceptional. So the question is, do we reinstitute a system that allows appeals as of right, or do we constrain appeals to particular circumstances? And if so, what are those circumstances? There are different views across the membership on that question, and that's one of the big things that we will have to find a way through if we're to restore the system. And it will not be easy, actually. You have the US with very strong views about appeal, and others who feel equally strongly that appeal as of right is an important feature of the system. And it's
Does Australia have a position?
So we definitely have a position, and although we accept that there were some problems with the way the appellate body had operated, we do think that having an appeal function is important in building a sense of predictability and security across WTO disputes, so that governments know they know how a provision is going to be interpreted, and they know it will be interpreted consistently. And that's something that we would contrast with, for example, the system that applies in relation to investor-state dispute settlement, where, as many will be aware, you don't have any international mechanism for testing or ensuring consistency of decisions made by different arbitral panels.
Okay.
So that's still a work in progress. But as I say, we were actually pretty pleased that everyone, including some of those who are sceptical or have expressed skepticism about the system, were quite prepared to sign on to intensification and acceleration of work with a view to getting the system up and running again. So that was quite a good outcome from us. On the WTO reform agenda more broadly, so on this question of deliberative reform that I mentioned, we had proposed, along with a number of other WTO members, that policy dialogues, broadly based policy dialogues, could be launched at MC13 on a few different issues that struck us as being of interest to a wide range of members. One of those was on trade and industrial policy, which is particularly relevant, I think, in the era of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the Green Deal in the European Union, but also questions about the way that China has subsidised some of its industries, either directly or through state-owned enterprises, and a sense that the way, and also I think a sense that with the green transition, governments may feel an imperative to intervene in supporting the development of new industries that would promote the transition in ways that they haven't had to before. So our sense was that this was an issue that really could have it was very important to WTO members, but also could potentially have an impact on WTO rules, because there are strict rules on subsidies and state aid in the WTO. So we thought this was something that it would be useful for the organisation to host a discussion of, rather than to have members simply deciding what they wanted to do unilaterally and leaving it to disputes to mediate any differences among them. Another area that we thought was worthy of discussion was on trade and inclusion. And so you and others will probably be aware that in a number of parts of the world, less so in Australia actually, I think for a range of reasons, but in a number of parts of the developed and developing world, there is a sense that there are sectors of communities that don't benefit from trade and that in fact may be penalised by trade. And this is something that's strengthened, I think, in the United States under the Biden administration and arguably also under the Trump administration, as well as in Europe. And again, we thought that it would be of interest to members to have a discussion about how different approaches governments take to promoting inclusion in the benefits of trade of various sectors of their communities. So that was another area that we thought it would be worthwhile launching a discussion of. Now, in the end, although a large number of members, a very large number of members actually supported both discussions, neither was agreed multilaterally. And in fact, in both cases, India blocked a decision to launch those discussions. So they weren't part of the outcome, which, was a disappointment from our point of view. On that, I think the next steps really will be for interested members to take up those discussions anyway in Geneva, but it won't be a membership-wide discussion, unfortunately. Then the next element of WTO reform was on negotiating reform, and so as I mentioned, there are these plurilateral negotiations, one of which, an investment facilitation for development agreement, was ripe for incorporation into the WTO framework of rules approaching Abu Dhabi. So this had 125 out of 166 members participating, so more than 3/4. So really a very widely adhered to initiative, mostly developing countries, as you'd expect, who really many of them really saw it as in their interests in promoting business interest and investment in their economies. If you are to incorporate a plurilateral agreement into the WTO framework of rules, you do need a consensus decision to do it. That's been done in the past, for example, with the government procurement agreement, which is a WTO agreement that not all WTO members are party to. And once an agreement is a plurilateral agreement, once it's in the WTO framework, it means you get access to WTO committees that are supported by the Secretariat. It means that disputes between them can be resolved by the WTO dispute settlement machinery. Now, unfortunately, India and South Africa indicated that they had reservations about incorporating the investment facilitation agreement into the WTO framework, so that did not happen. So the next step on that is for members the proponents of that negotiation, that agreement, to discuss the issue further in Geneva. It doesn't need a ministerial conference in order for a decision to be taken to incorporate it in the WTO framework. It could be done in Geneva if everyone agreed.
So in terms of India and South Africa's opposition to the incorporation of this investment facilitation for development initiative, I mean, it just seems unusual that they wouldn't support something like that. I understand it's because of their philosophical opposition to plurilaterals and the impact that incorporation of plurilaterals might have on their ability, I guess, to pursue or to require consensus positions, and the power that gives them to really influence the discussion and negotiations in the WTO. Is that basically why they opposed?
That's right. That's right. So it wasn't about anything in the substance of the agreement itself that they objected to, although India did raise some questions about whether an investment agreement, an agreement purely about investment, is rightly situated in the World Trade Organization, which doesn't actually have, in its view, a direct role or responsibility for investment. But it wasn't about that so much as you say, this principled view that plurilateral negotiations undermine the consensus-based nature of the organisation. And on that basis, they weren't comfortable with the idea that it should be endorsed in the way that the proponents were seeking.
Okay, crazy. Might I say that? I can say that. It's crazy. Anyway.
You can say that. I mean, it's interesting to contrast their position with the position of the United States, for example, which also didn't participate in the negotiations and will not join it, but was happy for the agreement to be incorporated in the WTO framework as rules, because it wouldn't prejudice its interests in any way.
I don't want to disrupt your order, but then, so does that lead on to the DOM Reg JSI, the Domestic Regulation JSI?
So I can talk about that. I mean, that didn't come up so much at MC13, but there was, as you say, for the benefit of listeners, there was an earlier plurilateral negotiation or joint statement initiative on services that effectively dealt with very similar issues relating to services as opposed to investment. So it's about facilitation of services. So really about transparency and predictability of government decision making. And the idea was that if you enhance predictability and transparency of decision making in those areas, it will promote investment and therefore trade. And that negotiation was concluded actually at the end of 2022 in substance, and that was going to be implemented in a slightly different way, so not through a consensus decision of the kind that was to be taken by in relation to the investment facilitation agreement. There was another mechanism we and others were going to use under WTO rules, which was simply to amend our schedule of commitments on services, which all WTO members have. Now, India and South Africa also blocked what's called the certification or endorsement of that outcome in the WTO. Most participants in that negotiation have actually negotiated a deal with India and South Africa on that issue that I suppose addresses India and South Africa's concern by largely removing the plurilateral element of the exercise and making it look like a unilateral decision taken by a number of members to update their services commitments. Australia, in fact, alone has decided not to do that, and we are still discussing with India and South Africa what it might take for them to lift their reservations on our revised schedule of commitments. But that didn't arise at MC13, that specific issue. So then, moving on then to e-commerce, we did achieve our outcome, which was to renew the moratorium for another 2 years. So it will now be in place until the end of March 2026, or until the next Ministerial Conference, whichever is held sooner. There is no date yet set for the next Ministerial Conference. Notionally, Cameroon has offered to host that, and I think the expectation is that that would be held before the 31st of March 2026. But in the meantime, the moratorium will continue, and alongside that, a work program that's been in place for a long time in the WTO about, and effectively that work program is aimed at identifying ways in which the benefits of digital trade can be spread across governments and communities. So that was a very positive outcome. So on WTO reform, I'd say we got our most important priority we achieved, and our lesser priorities we didn't. On e-commerce, we did achieve our objectives there. The next priority for us was really probably the accession of Timor-Leste, and that was a big moment. I mean, Timor-Leste is a least developed economy. It's a small economy. It's trying to integrate into ASEAN and the global economy at the same time. And I think the fact that it was prepared to take on the corpus of WTO rules as a member served as a very useful reminder that those rules are an effective way of attracting business and investor interest by demonstrating that there will be predictability because you've locked in the reforms through the WTO. And in fact, the Timor-Leste president and a very large delegation were in Abu Dhabi, and they were talking to investors from around the world with a view to making the most of their accession. So that was really very something that we were very happy with. Australia's provided a lot of technical assistance to Timor-Leste throughout the process, and it was good to see that happen. And really, as I say, a reminder of the fact that members do still see value or governments do still see value in the WTO and its rules.
Yeah, that was heartening. And Cosmoros as well. That's how you pronounce it.
Indeed, they also, so another least developed country, but from another part of the world, also exceeded, and that's important to the to the Africans. They're more in that part of the world. So that was another positive signal to have both of those exceed. Yes, so that was probably the main good news out of the conference.
Well, it's something. But of course, agriculture, Australia's done a heap of work on agriculture for decades, I should say, decades and decades, and doesn't give up the fight, which is really heartening, though difficult, I appreciate. So in terms of agriculture, I think some of the long-standing issues go to things like market access, continuing market access, domestic support. Key issue, India's position on public stock holding has been a key issue. Can you talk a bit about what happened in agriculture?
Indeed. So just to flag that we have not had a really significant outcome on agriculture since MC10 back in 2015, when members agreed to a set of rules on export competition that, among other things, led to the prohibition of export subsidies for agriculture. So that was a long-standing order of business for Australia and others who had suffered for a long time on a not level playing field because of export subsidies provided by WTO members. But nothing since then, which is obviously of concern to us. The other areas of agricultural reform that really have members are under an obligation to be pursuing and have been since the WTO agreement was established in 1995 are, as you say, on market access and domestic support or subsidies for farmers. Heading in, and we've tried at MC11 and we've tried at MC12 to achieve breakthroughs in those areas, but without success. Heading into MC13, we and other Cairns Group members, as well as a few others, were trying again. Our main focus was on domestic support rather than market access, and that reflects, for Australia, that largely reflects the fact that FTAs have delivered for us market access in most of our major markets, and that a market access outcome in the WTO is unlikely to exceed the level of commitment we get through FTAs. So we focus our attention instead on tightening rules applying to the provision of subsidies to agricultural producers, because that's not something you can do on a bilateral basis through an FTA. And it's an area of global trade that is of increasing concern to us because of the growth in subsidies on the part of the long-standing major subsidisers, in particular the EU and and the US, but also increasingly by China and India as their agricultural production increases. And then, as you say, there's been a separate strand really over more than a decade now that has been developed by India and some other developing countries such as Indonesia on seeking flexibility from existing rules to allow them to provide unlimited trade distorting subsidies for what they call their public stockholding programs, which is effectively where they purchase products from their domestic producers and hold them in government stocks and then release them. And they do that at inflated prices, and hence it's trade and production distorting. That's currently allowed under an interim mechanism that was agreed back at the 9th Ministerial Conference in Bali in 2013. And what India and Indonesia and others were looking for was for what's called that interim mechanism or solution to be made permanent. And that would be to allow those countries on an ongoing basis to provide legally, as I say, unlimited trade distorting subsidies. That's something that we and other agricultural producers in the Cairns Group, as well as, importantly, the United States, have long been resisting because of the risks to global trade and production that would flow, and indeed that we're already seeing as a result of the decision in Bali with Indian production of key commodities increasing dramatically. India made it very clear going into the conference that it wanted a permanent solution on public stockholding agreed by all members, and was really quite direct in its language, saying that if it didn't get that, then it would not guarantee that any other outcomes would be achieved, or that it would agree to any other outcomes at the conference, including on agriculture. When it did become clear in the course of the conference that there would be no consensus to agree a permanent solution on public stockholding. And that was a very good thing from Australia's point of view, that in some ways our main objective for the conference on agriculture had become a defensive one, which was not to allow this to proceed. But when it became clear that that was going to be the outcome, then India said, well, if there's not an outcome on that, then there will not be an outcome on agricultural reform at all. And so there wasn't. So that was very disappointing from our point of view. Next steps, look, it's a challenge. It will be increasingly difficult, I think, to sustain momentum or to generate momentum in agricultural reform discussions, but it's something that we will work hard with other Cairns Group members to remedy. Just on one point on the Cairns Group, there was a bright note, which was that we agreed that Ukraine would become a member of the Cairns Group in the margins of MC13. So that was a very positive development. It's the first European member of the Cairns Group for decades. And, I think having it in the organisation does enhance its diversity. So that's a very welcome thing from our viewpoint.
That's amazing. That's great news. With the UK leaving the EU, the UK seemed to always be the voice for open markets and liberalisation. So having them out of the EU and now bringing Ukraine in on the voice of open markets in agriculture is great news. But yeah, agriculture is just incredibly difficult. But keep fighting the good fight. In terms of the good fight going forward, so you're starting this job as ambassador at an incredibly challenging time for the system. I mean, it's always a challenge. The WTO always has challenges, but at this particular point in time, where there are great geostrategic tensions, where there is a sense that economic openness and trade rules are really taking the back seat to national security concerns and climate change concerns, I guess looking over the next 3 years in terms of Australia's objectives on the WTO agenda going forward. And I guess, so at the end of 3 years, can you say what you'd like to have seen outcome or achieved over your 3-year ambassadorial position? Ambassadorial role? There you go.
So
Crystal gazing.
it is something that I've been giving some thought to, of course. Look, I think there's just one thing coming out of MC13 is the challenge, as you say, created by the consensus-based decision-making nature of the organisation. So it's great that we had Timor-Leste and Comoros join. We now have 166 members. You can imagine that in order to get any decision made, you have to have 166 members of all different sizes at all different levels of development agreeing. It's tough. And when you're talking about new rules that will affect economic policies domestically, it's very, very tough. And I think the track record of the WTO in developing new rules shows that. So we're going to have to find ways to grapple with that. I think what you will see, I think there was a strong sense that members' aspirations were being frustrated by a very small number of members in Abu Dhabi. And I think that you may see some operate in a more concerted way to explore new ways of doing things. So these plurilateral formats, not only in relation to negotiations, but also in other elements of the organisation's work, such as policy dialogue. I think that will be one of the things that you'll see, and I would hope that's something that by the end of my term is seen as a healthy development, not something that needs to be a threat to the organisation, and that we are seeing members operate in the WTO, but in areas, taking things forward in areas where particular members are comfortable. But if they're operating in the WTO, they'll inevitably be doing it in a way that I think shows a consciousness of the flow-on effects to other members. And that's the healthy way from Australia's point of view to do it. We don't want to see plurilateral initiatives that are prejudicing the interests of non-participants in initiatives. So that's something that I hope we can build some sentiment towards over the next few years. And on that front, we do have the third of the three joint statement initiatives that was launched at MC11 was on electronic commerce, and that's a negotiation that Australia's co-chairing with Japan and Singapore, and that's very close to conclusion actually now, and we are aiming to conclude those negotiations by the middle of the year. And they will be, apart from the moratorium that we have on electronic commerce that I mentioned, that we've rolled over every couple of years, they will be the first global rules on digital trade, which is pretty amazing in 2024. It'll be an agreement that's broadly based. I wouldn't say it will address all the issues that stakeholders would want it to address, because some, quite frankly, are just not going to be in there, particularly on data. But that would still be a landmark agreement. So that will be something that definitely we'll be investing efforts in. The other big thing, I think, over the next couple of years will be to restore the dispute settlement system, get it up and running again. That will be extremely important. We don't want to see a protracted period of non-enforceability of rules that will, in our view, risk corrosion of the level of respect for the rules and possibly compliance with the rules. So that would be the other thing that we'd want to do. And then the third thing is really, and this goes to some of the issues that you mentioned, Prue, is identifying more active ways in which the WTO can support members as they go about working towards fundamentally important objectives, such as emissions reductions. And again, establishing the extent to which trade rules can support them in doing so without unintended consequences. And so that's a matter, I think, that we'll tackle in various ways, potentially even through some form of negotiations, but also testing the existing rules, seeing whether the existing rules are things that governments are currently finding fit for purpose. And geostrategic competition is definitely going to be an issue that overhangs the WTO. Some of the issues that we think can be tackled in a dialogue on trade and industrial policy relate to that, such as the use or how non-market economies fit into the WTO framework of rules, which were of course drafted for market economies, whether adjustments are needed there, and then whether how we might address the challenge that the US again has really thrown out to other members by saying that when it identifies a policy or a piece of legislation as something that's in its security interests, it should not be reviewable for compliance with the WTO agreement. And that obviously, at one level, that's perfectly understandable, but at another level, that opens up potentially a Pandora's box. So grappling with that challenge will be an important one as well. So it's quite a big agenda, as well as agriculture.
It's a huge agenda. It's a hopeful agenda, though. Things like if you got the dispute settlement system up and running again, that would be a game changer, I imagine. Having some meaningful discussions on industry policy, again, how the WTO can actually work in that space at this point in time would be, a huge achievement. So, yeah, a lot of work in front of you. We do have some questions, and I will encourage the people online, please feel free to put a question in the Q&A. We have a question from Andrew Robertson. So he's asking about the fisheries subsidies agreement. So obviously from MC12, there was some good outcomes from MC12, but there was some work left over. So Andrew asks, which members opposed the second wave of reforms in the fisheries negotiations and why? And what are the prospects for it moving forward? And if it is eventually successful, what would be the implications for Australian fisheries, if any? For example, impact on diesel fuel, subsidies for the commercial fleet. Sorry, that's a long question. I hope you can see it, James. But maybe you can pick one or as many of those as you'd like to respond to.
Yeah, so look, it's a really good set of questions, Andrew. And so for those who aren't aware, the first wave of the fisheries subsidies agreement that was concluded in 2022 provided disciplines or restrictions on subsidies that could be provided by governments to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing, as it's called by fisheries people. What was left was rules that would constrain subsidies that could contribute to overfishing or overcapacity, and that's what we're dealing with in the second wave. Now, no member is opposed to reaching or developing rules on overcapacity and overfishing. Everyone's on board with that. There are different perspectives on how those rules should operate really across members at different stages of development of their fisheries industries effectively. Now, in Abu Dhabi, we actually got quite close, and in the lead up to Abu Dhabi, we actually got quite close to concluding those disciplines. There were some reservations about aspects of the text that we were negotiating on. In particular, they related to things like whether they unduly constrained non-commercial fishing activities, so the what's called artisanal fishing in the negotiations, which was certainly not the intention. If governments need to support small communities, particularly in developing countries, this agreement should not be constraining that. So that was one of the issues that needed to be worked through, but I think we got very close on that. Really, one of the members that had the greatest reservations was India, and its argument was an interesting one. It was that there'd been a number of governments around the world subsidising and developing fisheries industries for decades, and they had developed big and now very muscular fishing industries. And when fisheries stocks were under threat, they wanted to develop rules that would strain everyone. But what that would do would be to bake in a playing field that wasn't level. So it would prevent India, for example, from developing a fishing industry. So it was seeking to have recognise the principle from climate change negotiations of common but differentiated responsibility, so that it would be allowed to subsidise the development of its fishing industry while others would not. And that was something that really ended up, we just couldn't get over in Abu Dhabi. So that will be one of the things that remains to be worked through. On the question of how an outcome would affect Australia, probably not very much. Well, actually, I don't think it would at all in regulatory terms, because the whole way the agreement's constructed is that it's to promote sustainability. So if you have fisheries policies that are sustainability, or programs that you can demonstrate are in line with sustainability of fish stocks, then you don't have to constrain support that you can provide to those activities. And Australia's standards in that area are good, and so we wouldn't see the need to change our policies. The question of fuel subsidies, non-specific fuel subsidies, has been raised by some in the course of the negotiations, which I should add have been going on for 22 years, so they're pretty long-standing. At this stage, it seems very unlikely that there will be any constraints in the agreement on general fuel subsidies, such as the diesel fuel rebate.
Terrific, thank you. We do have an anonymous question, but I think I suspect who it's from, who's a perfectly legitimate person. So the question goes to a recent panel report against Australia's anti-dumping measures on steel products for China. So this is not MC13. So I'm happy for you to take it on notice if you'd like to answer it. But basically the question is your views on the panel report's finding against Australia's anti-dumping measures on steel products from China, and how substantive these are for Australia's anti-dumping regime. And then the second question is, I'll let you answer that.
Well, yeah, so like any of these things, it's important to see that panel report in its context. So the panel report examines measures that China had identified, or decisions that China had identified, very specific decisions. And those decisions arose out of investigations that were conducted in 2014, 2015, 2019, so some time ago. And the Anti-Dumping Commission's practices have continued to evolve since then. So I think we see the issues that were identified in the panel report as very much confined to the specific investigations and decisions that flowed from them, and not having a broader impact on Australia's capacity to avail itself of trade remedies, including anti-dumping and countervailing measures.
Okay. We've only got 2 minutes. You've got a jam-packed calendar while you're back in Australia. I'll just give you one last question from Brian Clark. So he says, well, obviously being hopeful about the prospects for resolving the operational frustrations within the WTO, no multilateral agreement beyond the FTA has been realised in now almost 3 decades. If not the WTO, then what is the next best mechanism for global rulemaking in trade? Plurilateral based on, say, the CPTPP, and does this run the risk of trade blocks? I mean, I think you talked about plurilaterals, didn't you? But
that's a big question, Brian, so I don't think I can possibly do it justice in 2 minutes. Look, what I would say briefly is, I mean, there've actually been a couple. There was the trade facilitation agreement. There was, as I said, the agreement on export competition, and then there was the agreement on fisheries subsidies. And I think we're very close to another agreement on fisheries subsidies. Now, that would make it 3 agreements out of 30 years, not one. Still not a great strike rate. But I think if you compare it with comparable organisations elsewhere, you'll find that it's not a terrible record. I do think you're talking about a couple of different options there. One is if you're looking at plurilateralising, extending out an existing regional trade agreement, whether that's the CPTPP or something else, that's a broadly based agreement. That's a comprehensive instrument. That's one potential approach. how successful that might be, I think you could have a long discussion about. But the other one is, as Prue mentioned, what we have been doing in the WTO, which is selecting specific areas for negotiation where there is what we would regard as a sufficient mass of interest on the part of WTO members to develop rules plurilaterally. And that's something that I think we are reasonably hopeful about. We've reached agreement on 2 of those agreements and are very close on a 3rd. And I think that is an approach that we would see merit in investigating further and more actively, and that's something we'd be planning to do.
That's awesome. James, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We wish you all the very best. Australia is so fortunate to have you representing us in Geneva. I hope when we speak to you again in 3 years' time, you won't have any more grey hairs, that you'll survive the experience. But I have no doubt there is no better person to be really fighting these incredibly difficult but such important issues for us in the WTO. So thank you so much, and we wish you all the very best.
Look, thank you, Prue, and thanks to everyone for showing interest in this, and please do continue to show interest in it. It's really important for all of us. Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that's joined us online. This recording will be available on the ACITI YouTube channel. Yes, we have a YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you all. Signing off.
Thanks, Prue.